Okay, all right, so hello everyone. So this is going to be a talk about my research so far in my PhD, and my PhD is focusing on progression and detection in keratoconus. Here's a little bit about me. So originally I've got a computer science degree, and then recently I did an MRes in imaging and robotics at Imperial, and in between that I had over 5 years experience in software development, and I decided to try and do something a little bit more interesting. And so I'm now doing a PhD in applied computational methods to keratoconus progression and detection. So this talk is going to be divided into 3 parts. So the first part is discussing my work on modeling keratoconus progression, specifically to progression to cross-linking. The second part is going to be talking about my systematic review, which was the first piece of work I did for this PhD. It formed my literature review, and this was into machine learning algorithms applied to subclinical keratoconus detection. And the third part is going to be my current research, which is still a work in progress, and this is machine learning applied to early keratoconus detection. So part 2 and 3 are very closely related. So anyway, on to the first part. So a little bit of background. I'm sure everyone probably knows what keratoconus is, but I will at least, just give a little bit of a brief overview. So it's a disorder characterized by progressive thinning and distortion of the cornea. So on the left here, you've got a normal cornea, and on the right, you've got a keratoconic cornea. You can see on the right-hand side that the cornea is bulging, and it's quite hard to see, but it's also sort of thinning. So this diagram is a fairly nice, simple way of showing what, the effect of keratoconus. The prevalence of disease. Now, historically, people have used 1 in 2,000, but this number's not thought to be that accurate. And recent estimates, the prevalence is shown to vary from 1 in 375 in Northern Europe to as high as even 1 in 50 in some ethnic groups. The onset of the disease is typically after puberty, with subsequent progression at a variable rate, but it's over 2 to 3 decades. And usually by the time people reach 40, it tends to have stopped progressing because the cornea stiffens naturally with age. So the good news is, since the early 2000s, there's a treatment for keratoconus known as cross-linking, which arrests the progression. And this is a fairly simple treatment involving UVA light and riboflavin. It's shown to it's got a effectiveness of 98.3% of eyes, and it's also cost effective. And the bottom right here is a little diagram of a little picture of the cross-linking procedure. So the aim of this research was to create a model which allows us to predict an individual's risk of keratoconus progression. So more specifically, if at their first appointment we have a patient that turns up and they've got a certain set of corneal measurements and we've got their age and other things, can we predict the trajectory of their progression? So this could be useful to help clinicians plan the appointment schedule, and also I think it could help inform patients of their likelihood of progressing to cross-linking. So time to event analysis, this is the statistical model that we're using for this. And time to event analysis is a bit of a mouthful, but it essentially involves creating models for situations where we want to analyze the time until a specific event. So the event can either be a positive one or a negative one. So it could be time to marriage, or it could be time to the onset of disease. In our specific case, we're interested in analyzing time for keratoconus patients to proceed from their first ever appointment to having the cross-linking operation or not, because some people never have cross-linking. So simple time to event analysis typically produces charts like the one below. And this is an example only. These are not my results. I'm just using this chart to kind of elucidate what time to event analysis is about. So you have on the x-axis, you have, let's say, your the years since your first appointment. And on the y-axis, you have the probability of not experiencing the event. So you can see at time 0, at the first appointment, no one has cross-linking. So it's 100%. And then gradually, as more and more people have cross-linking, the numbers start to drop off. And then after 5 years, say 50% of people have experienced cross-linking. So in addition to creating charts, we can also examine how clinical data, such as corneal steepness or corneal thickness, and also patient data such as age, gender, smoking status, and genetic data, how this can affect the likelihood of progressing to cross-linking. And this is the most interesting part, I think, not just looking at charts, but how can we actually create a model from the variables that patients present with? Sorry about that. So a little bit of background on corneal measurements. So I've sort of used these words, or I'll be using these words a little bit. I just wanted to explain them in more detail. So pachymetry is the corneal thickness, which is simply the distance between the front and the back of the cornea. And then keratometry is a measure of the corneal curvature, or the steepness of the cornea. So if you imagine that the cornea is a rugby ball, then the steepest part of the cornea is along this axis. And this is measured by a variable called K max. And the flattest part of the cornea is along this axis. And this is measured by a variable called K min. So the data set that I used, it all came from the Moorfields early keratoconus clinic data. There was roughly 9 years of data available, constituting around 8,500 patients. These are the parameters that I used as input to the model. So remember, I'm trying to predict cross-linking by taking people's parameters at their first appointment and then seeing if we can figure out the trajectory of progression over time. So these are the inputs to the statistical model. These first three are all keratometry measurements, like I was speaking about in the previous slide. Pachymetry is what I was talking about in the previous slide as well. It's the corneal thickness. And we've also got sort of demographic data here as well, such as ethnicity, age at first appointment, sex, and smoking. So the results of the model, after fitting the model, the final, I'm not going to sort of present a table because it's beyond the scope of the talk, but essentially it contains several variables. We found several important variables, but the most important are age at first appointment and corneal steepness. And I think the most important thing that came, at least in the interpretation of the model, is that as your age increases, this reduces your risk of needing cross-linking, and also that as your keratometry increases, this increases your risk of needing cross-linking. So this is kind of like the interpretation of the model. We then wanted to validate the model. So once you've created a model, it's very important to understand how this model will generalize on new data. So in order to do this, what I did was I split up the data set into 75%, which I use for creating the model, and a 25%, which is unseen. And this was the model that I would test on. So what this chart is showing is essentially how the model performs on new or unseen data. And it refers to the 25% that was not used for fitting the model. I hope that's clear. In terms of the actual lines, so the solid lines are the real data. So this is what it should look like, and the dashed lines are the model. So you can see that the dashed lines are following the solid lines fairly well in all cases. Why are there 4 lines? Well, typically it's normal for in validating these models to try and not just plot one overall line of how well the model has performed, but to try and stratify it, to try and break it into groups and see how well it can discriminate between different risk groups. So you've got sort of high risk patients down here in the yellow line, which progress very fast, and then low risk patients up here in the blue line, and obviously the red and the green are in between. But the overall take home here is that, yeah, the dashed line is following the solid lines fairly well. So the model appears to generalize fairly well, at least when we're validating in the method that I described for this 75% for training, fitting, 25% for testing. Now, the most interesting part is how can we actually, now that we've created a model, we've sort of got an interpretation for it, we've provided some kind of validation. How can we actually use this model in practice? Or, another way of thinking about it is how can we create personalized predictions for individual patients? So in order to sort of show an example of this, I created 3 hypothetical patients. So I've got a low risk patient in green, a medium risk patient in red, and a high risk patient in blue. So the green patient is relatively old for keratoconus. It's age 35. Its cornea is not particularly steep. It's just 45. And then, yeah, the thickness of the cornea is relatively thick. So this person would be considered to be low risk. And you could present them with a chart like this, this green line, and perhaps the clinician would then decide, well, this patient is very low risk. They're unlikely to progress at a 5-year time point. So maybe we don't need to see them again. However, the blue line is a young patient with a very steep cornea. So it's age 18 with a very steep cornea and a relatively thin cornea. This patient has a much different trajectory of progression, and perhaps the clinician in this case would say, well, we should definitely treat them with cross-linking immediately. So in summary, we've created a model which can be used to plot personalized predictions of likelihood of progressing to corneal collagen cross-linking. In the future, we hope to turn this into a sort of a tool that can be used in the clinic to help clinicians plan the cross-linking appointment schedule, like I explained in the previous slide. And we also think that showing patients charts like this would be useful for their further understanding of how their condition is likely to progress. But there's one caveat here, and that's that although I did show some validation results, we need to actually get hold of an external data set from a different hospital or a different clinic and make sure that this model actually does work on a completely independent set of data so that we know that it's reliable. So that sort of ties up the first piece of research on progression. Now I'm going to move on to the systematic review, which was the first piece of work that I did. This is my literature review. So when you do a PhD, you have to spend the first 3 months reading literature and figuring out what other people have done to make sure you're not doing the same thing, and just to get some general background in the field. And this is the piece of work that came out of that. A systematic review is an academic name for, well, yeah, as it sounds, a systematic review of academic literature. So I'm going to give a little bit of background at a very high level about artificial intelligence, machine learning, and deep learning, because they're words that are thrown around a lot. What does it actually mean? What's the difference, etc., etc. So artificial intelligence is the very general, broad area, and generally speaking, it is mimicking the intelligence of humans or any other living entities. And machine learning is a subset of artificial intelligence. And this is a technique where a computer is said to learn from the data without using a complex set of rules. So the important distinction here is that artificial intelligence could be something like a doctor programming a computer with an enormous set of rules and then asking the machine to use these rules to make some kind of inference. But this wouldn't be described as machine learning because the computer hasn't actually learned anything. It's just been told explicitly what to do. Machine learning is when it actually the computer will learn, given a set of data, it will learn to make decisions itself rather than being told what to do. And then within machine learning, you've got this other sort of special subfield called deep learning, which is often thrown around. And this is a specific type which is inspired by the structure of the human brain. And yeah, it's commonly, one common technique in deep learning is neural networks. So what's the sort of potential for machine learning in ophthalmology? What's currently been going on, what people have been using. So diabetic retinopathy, machine learning has already been introduced into screening programs in the UK. And for age-related macular degeneration, which is another common retinal disease, Piers Keen at Moorfields and Google DeepMind have got an algorithm which is currently undergoing evaluation. However, there's no such algorithm yet for keratoconus detection, at least not in a clinical trial or in actual sort of day-to-day use. So there's definitely scope for a lot of work here. So now on to the systematic review itself. So if you were interested, this is in preprint. It's in its second round of revisions. We submitted it quite some time ago, but these things take quite a long time to come to fruition. But we're hoping it's going to get accepted very soon. It was over a 10-year period, so we analysed literature over a 10-year period. We looked at 4 different scientific databases, and we focused on a very early subset of keratoconus and only looked at studies that were properly validated. Don't worry too much about this. It's just to give you an idea of what it's like to actually do a systematic review. So you start off with potentially 2,000 candidate papers, and then you apply a set of criteria. You filter them down to a smaller subset of maybe 170 papers, and then eventually you read each one in detail, and you come out with a final set you're going to analyze. And in our case, this was 26. So we went from 2,000 down to 26 articles for our review. So we kind of split the review into 2 parts. First, we looked at the input data that these algorithms use for keratoconus detection. And the second part was looking at the algorithms themselves. So this is a brief hierarchy of the input data that is used for keratoconus detection. So there's 4 main types. There's refraction data, which is how well the eye bends light onto the retina. There's imaging data, which is, as it sounds, it's taking images of the cornea using things like the pentacam or optical coherence tomography. There's biomechanical data, which involves seeing how the cornea deformed in response to some kind of force, like a puff of air. And there's also other forms of data, such as genetic data, demographic data, such as age, sex, ethnicity, and also associated disease, such as allergies. Just going to give a brief run through of these different types of data. So refraction data, typically people are using aberrometry, and aberrations are they're produced by imperfections in the refracting surface of the eye. 8 out of 26 of the papers used this data. An example of an aberration, a simple aberration, is an astigmatism, which is essentially where the light is scattered randomly onto the back of the retina, whereas in a normal eye, it's supposed to be focusing nicely on the back. There's many different kinds of aberrations. I'm not going to go into them, but it's just an idea of the types of data that people look at for diagnosing or detecting keratoconus. The other next form of data, the biggest class of data used for keratoconus detection, is imaging data. So pretty much all of the articles used imaging data. Now, imaging data can lead to 2 different subtypes. One is heat maps, such as in the bottom left. This is a heat map produced by the pentacam, which is commonly used for detecting keratoconus, analyzing keratoconus. So these are kind of interpolated or sort of synthetic images created of the cornea, showing you sort of relevant areas of distress, or say, well, relevant areas of, say, curvature in this case, and this is thickness, and this is elevation, so how the kind of what the surface of the cornea looks like. And there's also numeric data which comes out of these imaging systems, such as pachymetry, elevation, keratometry, and displacement. But let's not worry too much about what all these different terms. I've already spoken about a couple of them, but I won't go into too much detail about elevation and displacement for now. But anyway, the takeaway from this slide is that imaging data is probably the most important piece of data that is used in keratoconus detection algorithms. There's also biomechanical data, which, as I mentioned before, it refers to how the cornea distorts when you apply some force to it, typically a puff of air, but it's not very commonly used for keratoconus detection algorithms. And then finally, there's demographic data, which is, again, not very commonly used, but it's surprising because ethnicity is well known to be a risk factor in keratoconus. So it was surprising that there was no papers that actually included this data in their algorithm. And also no papers looked at associated disease, such as allergies, nor did they use genetic information in their models. So the second part of the review was to look at the actual sort of methods that people are applying when detecting early keratoconus. This slide is definitely beyond the scope of this talk, but it's a very brief idea of all the different types of algorithms that are used in detecting keratoconus. There's been a fair amount of work in this area. It's fair to say that most of these algorithms are fairly traditional machine learning algorithms. So the sort of right-hand side of this chart is all, they're fairly kind of old-fashioned methods. Some people would consider them to be statistics rather than machine learning. It's a fairly small subset of papers that really looked at sort of newer, more fashionable techniques, such as neural networks for detecting keratoconus. So the kind of summary of the review, which I think is sort of interesting for you, is perhaps that there's obviously a wide array of input data used for early keratoconus detection. And in terms of how this is shaping my further research, no studies that we've found are actually using raw imaging data. So everyone is using sort of numeric data, which is coming out of devices, or sort of these synthetic heat maps of corneas. No one's actually using the raw images that come out of imaging devices. So this is we identified this as an area to sort of move forward in. Demographic data was seldom incorporated to any models, which was interesting because it's well known to be quite important in detecting keratoconus. And then in terms of the algorithms that are used, like I mentioned in the previous slide, most work is focused on traditional machine learning, and sort of newer methods, newer, more fancy methods haven't been applied that well yet. So this, leaves the door open for quite a bit of interesting research. Which brings me to part 3, which is my current research into machine learning applied to keratoconus detection. So the aim, very broadly, is from a set of raw images, how can we classify different grades of keratoconus? So when I say grades, this could be sort of, early keratoconus versus advanced keratoconus, or it could just be as simple as a normal eye versus a keratoconic eye. But the ultimate aim, as I was talking about in my systematic review, is to classify a sort of early form of keratoconus from normal using raw images. And here's a sort of a brief, a sort of simple diagram of the ideas. You take a raw image of a cornea, you feed it into an algorithm on the computer, and you classify it as either keratoconus or normal, as a simple example. But ideally, I would like this to be subclinical keratoconus and normal, not just an advanced form. Because an advanced form of keratoconus is relatively easy to detect already. So let's give some background on neural networks, because this is the type of machine learning algorithm that I'm applying to this problem. So our brains, they use a very large network of neurons already for processing information. So a single neuron receives information via the dendrites from other neurons, and it transmits a signal only if the result of doing some kind of calculation in the middle is greater than some threshold. So this is how the brain essentially passes information around at a very sort of high level. And we can model this inside a computer as the above. So these are essentially the inputs from the other neurons. This is the part of the neuron that actually makes the decision, and here is the output which gets passed on, passes the decision on to other neurons. So if you take very many of these and you create a network of them, then you get something which loosely models the human brain. So you can think of each of these as one of the neurons in the last slide. And the idea here would be to feed an image into this network, and out the other side, it will spit a result, which is, for example, keratoconus or normal. So how does this actually work in practice? How can we actually use this in a bit more detail? So the idea is to take an image, you feed it into your network, and initially it will come up with some kind of prediction. This will probably be random to the first time it's run, because it has no clue. And then you also have, with this image, you also have a label. And then you compare your prediction to your label, and this gives you some kind of error, some kind of, whether you got it right or wrong. And then you pass this back into an algorithm which updates this network. So it just slightly changes it so that hopefully it gets a bit better. And then you repeat the process. So you feed in a new image, goes through the network, it creates a prediction, it's slightly better this time. Then you compare the prediction to your label, you get the error, you feed it into the algorithm, and you update the weights. And then you repeat and you repeat and you repeat. And eventually, over a long period of time, this network will learn how to predict these images with hopefully high accuracy. That's essentially how the neural network training process works. So for the actual research itself, I have images acquired from a device called the MS39, which is an anterior segment optical coherence tomography device. This is given as 31,000 scans, and each has got 25 slices at different angles. So if you can imagine the cornea, there is a camera sort of sliding around the outside of the cornea, all different angles, taking 25 different slices. And the number of patients in this case, well, for our data set, is 3,500. So we've got a mixture of private and NHS. This is what the device looks like, and these are the images that it produces. So the specifics of the algorithm that I'm trying to use is, I want to exploit the fact that we've got 25 slices. A lot of sort of machine learning tasks will just sort of use one image of something and then try and classify it. But in our case, we've got this interesting situation where for every eye, we've got 25 slices. I know I don't have 25 here, I have 8, but I just couldn't draw that many. So I want to somehow exploit the fact that I've got 25 images. And so I'm going to use a fairly advanced technique to do this. So I basically feed in my 25 images into 25 individual neural networks, combine the result, put them into another neural network, and then out the other side comes a classification result, for example, keratoconus or normal. Now the results so far, it's a work in progress, because we haven't quite finished it yet. We're hoping to publish it end of the summer or autumn. But yeah, I've looked at 3 different tasks so far. So I've got sort of stage 1 keratoconus versus stage 4 keratoconus, and I've managed to classify this with very high accuracy. Normal versus any type of keratoconus, I've managed to classify this with sort of 87% accuracy. And then a more complex task of trying to classify different stages, like 4 different stages, stage 1 versus stage 2 versus stage 3 versus stage 4. I've got this at 78.3% accuracy so far. So the accuracy is quite variable depending on the task. I think there's still quite a bit of work to be done on this. But it's clear that identifying specific stages, like more groups of keratoconus, is more challenging than just looking at normal versus KC. So the summary of this piece of work so far, I think machine learning and neural networks can definitely be used effectively to classify keratoconus from raw images, which is an interesting piece of work that hasn't really been done properly before. Our next aim is to try and classify normal versus subclinical KC, which is a much more interesting problem. If we can catch keratoconus early, it's much more useful than just saying, I can tell if someone's got keratoconus or not, because we can already do that. We can already classify advanced KC versus normal. And in addition to this, we want to include other types of data into the model, such as demographic data, genetic data, and biomechanical data. So yeah, that sums up my work so far. And if anyone's got any questions, I'd be happy to take them. Thank you.
Oh, that's really great. Oops.
Do you want me to?
That was really good. Thank you very much, Howard. Very, very surprising, actually. The thing that surprised me was that none of the papers looked at other conditions. Everyone knows that, that people with KC have all sorts of weird allergies and skin conditions, and yet none of the papers you looked at other conditions. Is that the fact?
Well, I mean, it's worth saying that this systematic review that I did was limited to a subset of papers which focused on machine learning and subclinical keratoconus. So it's definitely not to say that no one has looked at associated disease before, because they definitely have. But at least when looking at subclinical keratoconus and machine learning algorithms, no one has worked on this before. So no one has worked on associated disease. At least that's what we found. Yeah, so there is definitely work out there, but it wouldn't fall into the sort of niche that I was doing my review on.
Right. Anyone got any questions?
Yes, can we go back to the
full screen?
yeah.
I'm trying to go back to gallery view.
Oh, right.
Yes, exactly.
There we are. We're back on it now.
And I do have a question, which relates to the first part of the research, the predicting the trajectory. What I wanted to ask was, I've heard from a number of members who have difficulty deciding what to do about the good eye, in inverted commas, and having CXL on the good eye has sometimes produced bad results. So the potential of your research is really promising in terms of being able to make a better decision about whether to treat the second eye. Is that something that you are hoping to look at?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so I think we are probably going to look at later on, probably specifically looking at this sort of asymmetric keratoconus. Yeah, so I think it is something that we will look at separately. But at least in terms of, this research where it is at the moment, I suppose, each eye is looked at independently. So you could feed your good eye and your bad eye into the model, it would give you a different prediction. So yeah, I think that's potentially where it's useful, but obviously the doctors who are actually doing the, running the clinic would take everything into account. But, maybe if the model said that they shouldn't touch it, then maybe they'd be more inclined not to touch it. I couldn't really say yet.
Yeah, I was going to ask about, in your model, you had a flag there for ethnicity. There's white British and other.
Yeah.
Is that really relevant for a global model, or are you going to expand it later, or just you're only planning to look at the UK?
So currently we've only got data from the Moorfields Eye Hospital, and the ethnicity data was very difficult, to be honest. We don't really have very reliable labels for it. So that was kind of inside the actual paper itself. We've discussed this at length, why it was, other people have found ethnicity as a relevant variable in keratoconus progression, but it's not something that I found in my research. And I think part of that is because the data is so unreliable. We only really had it for 50% of the patients. So the best we could do was just to kind of do it very coarsely as sort of white versus other. But in an ideal world, you'd want to have, many different classes, many different categories to be more specific.
Great. Okay, thank you.
At the very start, how did you find out, how did you get the idea to do this research at the very start? If you didn't know anybody who had KC and stuff, is there a group who say this is something that would be good to research, or how does it all happen at the very start?
It's an interesting question. I was looking for an interesting project with a defined sort of endpoint for the PhD. So I looked at numerous different projects, and this is one that stood out because, they had a lot of data. They had a good set of doctors who were kind of motivated by the research, and there's also a good kind of engineering team to work with on it. So yeah, this was kind of why this particular project stood out to me. Yeah.
Thank you.
Anil has got a question. Anil was he deals with keratoconus at Moorfields. Can you unmute Anil and ask your question?
Oh, hi there. Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, hi. Yeah, I missed the first 5 minutes. Did you review the current risk factors for keratoconus progression?
Yes.
Oh, could you just reiterate what you found actually, if there's anything new in there?
So it depends which papers you read. But I mean, the most recent paper that I read basically came to the same conclusion, which is essentially that Kmax and age are the two most important risk factors for keratoconus progression. But older papers, such as the work from Stephen Tuft in like the late 90s, who's my sort of primary supervisor, I think those models included Kmin, Kmax, and ethnicity, but I don't want to tie myself to that, to be honest, because I don't remember exactly which risk factors, but definitely ethnicity had been included in some of the other models. But it's invariably age, some keratometry, and then ethnicity in the older papers.
Okay. It just anecdotally in clinic, I mean, we often see patients with very advanced keratoconus, high Kmax, irrespective of age. So even over 35 can continue to progress. And I don't know if you came across that actually when you were doing your literature reviews.
No, I didn't come across that anecdotally. Actually, that's interesting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just one of the little things we find in clinic, but you always wonder if there's actually any evidence behind it in the literature, and I've not come across it myself, but yeah, I just wondered if you had.
So what's the latest age you've seen progression for keratoconus at?
Well, I've seen new cases, with definite progression, so new presenters to the clinic over the age of 40. And these are people who've had regular eye tests and they have unequivocal keratoconus, age over 40. So they've obviously progressed to get to that stage. And then often, certainly in the contact lens clinic, we see patients, not that uncommon, I suppose, who may be 40, 50, and their keratoconus is still progressing. And these usually are patients with corneas that are too thin to be cross-linked. So they're, definitely at the advanced end of the keratoconus spectrum.
Okay, that's very interesting, actually.
Perhaps I can jump in there, David, because I am actually one of those older patients whose KC did actually progress later in life. My question, though, is specific for Howard. When a clinician uses your model, and assuming your model is reasonably reliable, how do you know where a specific patient actually sits on the curve when you're presented by the patient? Do you get my point?
Well, you presented with the patient at their first appointment. You feed the data into the model, and then you say you can sort of say from the chart, like at different time points, what's their probability of progressing would be. So it gives you, say, for a particular person at different time points, what their probability would be.
Right. Based on age and K numbers, etc.
Age, K numbers, pachymetry, but most importantly, age and K numbers. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Could you model the cornea as that's a tomographic image? It's a 3D image, and then get some sort of metric from that.
Yeah.
Almost normalize that.
Yeah.
And then you can see the degradation of the cornea that way.
There is work that's been done on that. Yes. Yeah. I think finite element analysis. Yeah. This is not something that I'm probably going to be looking into. I'm going to focus more on machine learning, but yeah, there is literature out there. People have modeled it as a 3D structure. Yeah.
So are you with your results, are you normalizing them so you have a baseline and then your base, so then you do see the degree?
Yeah.
Thanks.
No worries.
Right.
Do any of the people who are on the phone have questions who aren't on?
Rosemary's the only one on by phone. Hello, Rosemary.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, because a couple of things actually. We're talking about difficulties of people like the high street opticians that may not have all the necessary kit. which also brings up something else I was wondering, which is a possibility of incorporating, if you like, the non-scanning risk factors that come in. Like, I mean, we all know how many people with KC have hay fever, eczema, asthma, multiple allergies, as you've mentioned. I mean, other risk factors would be there's a family history of it. Is it possible to throw in there things like, well, this person has such and such a K-max and a K-min rating if you've got the kit to do it, but also you've got, well, they're 15, they've already got hay fever, they've already got asthma, their mum's got KC, their grandma's got KC, high risk here.
Do they rub their eyes?
Things like that. I mean, your trouble I'm in it, I guess, is that, you know, they're going, if you're using anonymized standard data sets from everybody who comes to the hospital and has got KC and you're using it, they don't have that sort of information in your data set, so it's very hard to test it. But certainly I was thinking in terms of articles in trade press for opticians, maybe, things. But if you have a patient who is complaining about poor vision and it looks like their cornea may be sort of on the skew with, well, ask them if they've got allergies in the family, ask them if they've got other things related in the family, things like that, and then yep, test them out even if we're not quite sure how well they do on this machine that we don't have, because that's a family risk factor. So that was one thing I was going to comment. The other thing, sort of slightly different, you said at the early stages, Howard, of your presentation, you commented that cross-linking is cost-effective. I wonder if you knew how that had been established and if there were general principles in how they'd established it was cost-effective that could be cross-applied to see what other to use to assess the cost-effectiveness of other possible interventions for KC.
Okay.
I'm thinking in particular in that latter case about arguments about whether it's worth fitting KC people with particular types of contact lens or other things, and we're saying, well, yes, it must be if only we knew how to work it out. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, on the allergies side of things, so this is definitely something that I did actually include that in my progression model.
You mentioned allergies, yes.
Yeah, but it didn't really come out with anything significant. And then for detection, I haven't got to looking at sort of more simplistic data yet. I've been looking at images so far, but I mean, I'm definitely going to investigate all of these different things later on in the PhD into detection. But for now, I'm just looking at images. But you're right, allergies are very important. But I'd say that one thing we need to be careful of definitely is you don't want to overdiagnose people. It's with all these algorithms, it's a trade-off between underdiagnosis and overdiagnosis. You sort of, yeah, you don't want to worry people and necessarily, but equally, you don't want to miss people that do have keratoconus. So yeah, we have to be very careful about developing these algorithms. And the second question about cost effectiveness, I don't have the specific details of how they analyze whether it was cost effective or not, but I imagine it would have been based on clinical trials and looking over a long period of time and seeing what it cost the NHS versus, you know, treating with contact lenses and eventually proceeding to graft, which was the old way of treating it. I don't have the specific details of that, unfortunately, but it's a very good question.
But I think actually there is already evidence, isn't there, from blood and transplant that fewer corneal transplants are now being done for keratoconus. They're being done for other reasons, but the number of transplants is reduced, which is probably linked to the fact that so many people are now getting cross.
Yeah, I think transplants are now pretty much gone. I think everyone does cross-linking. It's only for very severe cases that haven't.
And people like us who are too far gone for cross-linking long before they discovered cross-linking.
We're too old.
There was actually a similar analysis. So for the progression work that I did, this was inspired by a paper from a couple of years ago that was analysing an older data set for progression to corneal graft. There is actually a very similar piece of work out there about progression to corneal graft, just if you're interested.
Very pleased with the way this has gone this morning. So has anyone got any final questions?
But not a question, David, but can I just do a plug for the mark? As I'm seeing some new names. Sorry, my name's Elaine. I've been on the committee for a long time, and I've got a stack of mugs at home and T-shirts. So excuse me just for plugging this, but as I've seen some new names on this on this coffee morning.
Mug's not in shot, Elaine. Hold it up higher.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, is that better?
Yeah, it's good.
I'm disappointed our two models aren't wearing their T-shirts, but never mind.
Sorry. We have mugs. We've got loads of mugs, and we have T-shirts as well. They are black with sort of a keratoconus logo in a sort of a silvery purpley colour. They come in medium and large. Just let David know, and he will contact me, and I can ship them out.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Howard. This has been really good.
Yeah, no problem. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
When the research comes out, I'll send it over to you.
Well, certainly.
Great, thank you.
Anne and I will be in touch. So, okay, I'll end it there then. Thank you everyone for attending.
Thanks.
It's been really good and well supported. Right. Cheerio. Thanks.
Yes.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.